Hello and welcome to episode 150 of the Chills at Will podcast. What a pleasure. What an honor to be joined today by Elizabeth Williamson, and just a little bit of the bio. I'm sure there's a lot more to fill in, but this is from the New York Times website. Elizabeth Williamson is a feature writer in the Washington Bureau and a former member of the New York Times editorial board. She has worked at the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and spent a decade as a foreign correspondent in Eastern Europe. She is the author of Sandy Hook, An American Tragedy and the Battle for Truth, which is published by Dutton. And we'll be definitely be talking about that a lot. First of all, welcome. How are you today?
Thanks, Peter. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing okay, thanks. I would love for you to, maybe shout out the book and the publisher and maybe any favorite places to buy it or anything like that.
Sure. So as you said, it's called Sandy Hook, An American Tragedy and the Battle for Truth. And it really is about the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting and the conspiracy theories that circulated, and how that story of how that happened is kind of a foundational story of how false narratives and disinformation have sort of permeated our society in the decades since Sandy Hook. And it's published by Dutton Penguin Random House. You can get it at your favorite bookseller or at the library.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the shout out to the libraries as well, right?
Yeah,
Great
no,
places to get 'em.
absolutely.
Yes. Well, I would love to get right into the book. I guess according to the acknowledgments, it seems like in the book itself, it seems that it was 2018. It was a pitch from, is that Elizabeth Bumiller? Am I pronouncing the name correctly?
Bumiller, yeah.
Bumiller.
My boss.
Right. Your namesake, or, whatever. I don't know what the word in English is. In Spanish, they say tocayo. But,
Yeah.
How did that come about? I mean, is that your usual beat? I know it's probably an old fashioned newspaper term, but is that your beat?
No, it's still
originally?
used.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a feature writer in the DC Bureau of the Times. And so I'm kind of a free ranger. I do a lot of profiles and, just stories about various phenomena or things that happen, but typically more Washington-based stories. But when this lawsuit, so this was in the middle of 2018, as you said, the families of 10 Sandy Hook victims altogether filed 4 separate lawsuits, later combined into 3, against Alex Jones. And they were saying that, they were alleging that he defamed them because for years he spread the false narrative that Sandy Hook was a so-called false flag operation planned by the government as a pretext to confiscate Americans' firearms. And in so doing, he spread that fake theory, he implicated a number of these family members, several of them by name. And so initially, the first 2 lawsuits were filed in Texas, where InfoWars, Alex Jones's radio and online outlet, is based. And they were filed by Lenny Posner and Veronique De La Rosa, whose son Noah Posner is the youngest Sandy Hook victim, and by Neil Heslin and Scarlett Lewis, whose son Jesse Lewis died in the shooting as well. Lenny is significant in that he's a central character in the book. And he was someone who recognized early on, he has a tech background. He had dabbled for entertainment in various, non-destructive conspiracy theories. He understood how conspiratorial material travels, especially on social media. And he recognized this as not a one-off, that this was not some isolated freakish occurrence, but rather this was the beginning of what became a kind of through line of false narratives over the decades since Sandy Hook. So it went from, false theorizing around Sandy Hook to most mass shootings Then came Pizzagate, the Great Replacement Theory that led to the violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, then coronavirus myths, and finally the 2020 election conspiracies that led to conspiracy theories that led to the violence at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. So in the book, I trace that through line, making the point that Sandy Hook really was this pivotal story, and that kind of foretold the world of lies that we live in right now, and how those conspiratorial lies have poisoned our national discourse.
Right. That ended up being a great, pitch or summary of the book. You do such a great job with that through line, with those through lines. And, the question about, are the conspiracy theories around Sandy Hook, are those new? Are those, what's the history behind them? I guess, what is it like? Are they features or are they bugs? Right, to use like the social media term,
right?
Or the computer
Yeah,
term,
and
right?
I make the case in the book that really they are features of
Right.
the way we are right now as a society.
So my question is, and I appreciate so much in the book, if they're lies, you call them lies, right? You don't call them falsehoods or, erroneous. I mean,
Yeah,
you use the
for the
word.
sake of variety, I try to mix it up a little, but they are
Sure.
lies. Yeah.
Right. So I wonder, like, where, you as a newspaper reporter, ideas, I know objectivity, and, the book, I mean, you don't center yourself in the book as a great writer that you are. It's not about you, but, you do use I when you need to, and all that.
Mhm.
But I just wonder about issues of objectivity, where there are things that are so clearly lies, there are things that are so clearly false, and things that are so clearly true, that the shooting happened, that these people, these kids and parents and adults were unfortunately killed. I mean, just
Yeah.
absolute horrific tragedy. I wonder if
Yeah.
that line between objectivity and the fact that you're a human being.
Yeah. I mean, it was so your question is just
How you'd be able to
how did
maintain that objectivity, I guess.
objectivity? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do lose the objectivity at some points. I think toward the end, I'm talking with James Fetzer, who is a disgraced University of Minnesota professor who became, one of the super spreaders of these lies, with Alex Jones being obviously the ultimate super spreader. But there is at one point where I'm interviewing him in my car, actually, outside of his house, because his family was so incensed about how much trouble, his spreading of this conspiracy theory had gotten him into, because he edited a sort of anthology of Sandy Hook lies called Nobody Died at Sandy Hook, real subtle title.
Right.
And he was sued by Lenny Posner for defamation, and Lenny won a $450,000 judgment against him, which later escalated with court costs up to more than $1 million. This is not the kind of money that this retired professor has.
Right.
And so his family was really angry about this situation. And moreover, they didn't want him to get himself into any more trouble by talking with a New York Times reporter. But at the end of that conversation, I just was sort of fed up. I just kind of felt, this guy is such a pernicious attention seeker, obviously trying to gain some notoriety for himself, try to build some online fame by spreading these lies. And, he's certainly not a solitary Sandy Hook conspiracy theorist. He was a, so-called 9/11 truther. He questioned the JFK assassination, put out there just a wildly implausible alternate theory of the case on that one. And he was a rabid anti-Semite and Holocaust denier. So he's not an easy person to have a conversation with. And I did kind of lose it there, but I always tried to to bear in mind the fact that, the reason that I was doing the book and the reason that the families wanted to participate in this project was so that they could sound the alarm about the spread of disinformation in society and what it was doing to not only vulnerable people like them, but to our democracy. And so in order to try and understand how these lies spread and who the people are who spread them and why, you have to kind of take a step back and just not focus on how vehemently you disagree or how angry one any human being can get at the damage done to these families, because they were followed on the street. People dug through their trash. They looked in their windows. They defaced memorials to the dead. They defaced these families' personal social media accounts. They approached them on the street. They wrote to them at their homes, so they knew that these conspiracy theorists knew where they lived. So they terrorized them for years. So if you dwell on that, it makes it almost impossible to talk with these people.
Exactly. Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I know it's such a hallmark of great journalism like your own that that objectivity throughout the book, builds that repulsion. I mean, you're talking about that scene where you describe James Fetzer, he's got bad breath and he's, you describe what
That
he's
was a bit of a
wearing.
cheap shot.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I'm not going to say they're cheap shots, but I really
We were
enjoyed.
confined in a Chevy Malibu, so it was
Right,
hard not to notice.
right. Well, I enjoyed in a smaller way. I enjoyed the sick SIC that you use throughout the book. Where it's like, hey, come on, these people are just speaking this madness. Let's call it what it is, right? That's like the journalist burn, right? Sick SIC in parentheses. But
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that
Misspelling seems to be a hallmark of the spread of this material.
right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. But that repulsion comes through, I mean, as it should. Just like you said, I mean, didn't you say there were like 4 shooters in for the JFK assassination, and including like his bodyguard or
And
something like that?
yeah, and that,
Yeah.
this wildly improbable cast of
Right.
characters was involved, and, Hollywood and officialdom. And yeah, it was just, too nutty to repeat here. But yeah, really wildly implausible. And here I
Absolutely.
am, I'm speaking to you from Dallas. And,
Right?
I'm very near where the whole assassination occurred, and where Lee Javier Oswald was incarcerated before he was killed by Jack Ruby. And so when you actually go through this history, you realize, you understand why people raise questions. That's what's interesting. If you go through the facts of that case, you can understand why, particularly a traumatized nation that had never had something quite like this happen in its modern history, would raise questions about, various aspects of what happened. But that's a different thing entirely. We can acknowledge that government does lie to us at times, and that there have been in history conspiracies, and that involve lying to the American public. But the departure for these individuals is that they tend to constantly and always distrust official narratives, the government, and any bearer of what they deem to be a sort of establishment or an official report.
Right. You in the middle of the book, and I guess in a way it's the chronological start of the book, kind of, as far as when you were part of it, and that's when you met up with Alex Jones for 3 hours, right? And that was, I guess, through his ex-wife. Is that correct?
Yeah, she was the one who first gave me said, well, here's how you get in touch with them, etc. Yeah. And I had come to town to attend actually the very first hearing in the Sandy Hook cases, and it just happened to coincide with a family court hearing around a custody battle he was having with his ex-wife. So I attended that hearing. I asked him after court if he would sit for an interview. He said, sure. And so rather than, schedule it for a later time, I just went to InfoWars and said, well, okay, no time like the present, here I am. And he wound up letting me in and talking with me, to my surprise.
Well, I mean, it's one thing, and I've heard it said before in different ways, where it's one thing to say that he's a coward, but you just describe it so well. You call him a coward. I mean, he's like, how could somebody spread these lies? And we'll talk about in a minute what, if anything that he believes about the lies, about the conspiracy theories, but how could somebody possibly do that with so much pain, for these families? And you say, well, he's a coward. He's the reason he's able to do it is that he does it from afar, right?
Yes.
He does it from afar. He doesn't see the people up close. And I know, like in the recent trial, right? Like he kind of like, I guess he like passed a note maybe to one. It's like, hey, I'd like to talk to you, or I'm sorry about this. And you mentioned some ideas of that too. So I just love to know about the idea of that, of the coward. And Veronique De La Rosa.
Veronique, yeah.
Right. She has that line that was so moving to me, that is about kind of like the keyboard warrior, for lack of a better word. She
Yeah.
wrote uh something to the effect of the remove this is from yours. The
Yeah.
remove of the internet nurtures groupthink bubbles whose members reward one another for attacking victims in the name of quote truth. And she says, when anybody's behind a machine, whether it's a gun or a computer or a car, a dehumanization takes place that makes it easier to commit an act of violence. That
Yeah.
dehumanization and of course, obviously, I think computers obviously, but then with the guns, with what happened there. So I'm rambling here, but just the idea of him as a coward and being able to remove himself from the situation.
Yeah. I think that that is just human nature, right? We say things online, and this is one of the, the really bad unintended consequences of social media.
Right.
That remove that social media creates, and yet that immediacy that it grants,
Mm-hmm.
um, is really an evil, because it allows you to say and write the most wounding, personal, vicious things, without that, that adage of write it down, put it in a drawer, think about it overnight, and chances are you're not going to send it in the morning. It removes that thought process and that sort of human reconsideration of one's impulsive actions,
Mm-hmm.
and it reaches millions of people in minutes. And it also allows us to be cruel in a way that's only possible when we're not face to face. And there are people who pick up on all of this outrage and vitriol, and the algorithms in social media reward outrage because that's engagement.
Mm-hmm.
So the more people engage, the more the algorithms boost that content. And so it just becomes this, nastiness machine.
Mm-hmm.
And the families and many other people have really suffered from this. And Alex Jones really epitomizes this because he is actually a very kind of cosseted, protected individual. He's
Right.
very wealthy now. He hires people to be around him, his lawyers, to protect him from himself, or to certainly defend him when he does get himself in trouble. And it gives him that remove permanently in his real world life too. And so, that was actually pierced during these trials when
Mm-hmm.
Scarlett Lewis, the mother of Jesse Lewis, came into court. Alex Jones came to testify in court
Mm-hmm.
in Austin, Texas this summer. And he thought that he would come in, hold forth, and leave. He wouldn't have to deal with the families at all. They would be sitting, at the plaintiff's table in the courtroom, but there would be no real exchange between them. But what happened was Scarlett wasn't finished testifying from the morning. So after lunch, when Jones showed up, she went back on the stand. And for 90 minutes, she addressed the answer to every question at him, saying, truth is so important in our world. You are helping to erode truth. People are more polarized than ever. You are partly responsible for that. And so it was really compelling.
Yeah.
And it was also cathartic for the families to have one of their number confront him directly and show him the damage that he'd done and really take him to task.
Mm.
And he had successfully before and since pretty much avoided that kind of a reckoning.
Right. Well, I mean, with the exception of like some weirdly timed like jokes at Mar-a-Lago, you feel like you could be describing President Trump, ex-President Trump,
There are a lot of parallels.
right?
There's Alex Jones is a diagnosed narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
He sees everything in terms of how it affects him. He's constantly persecuted when someone disagrees with him or calls out the damage that he does.
Oh yeah,
It's their fault. He is sort of incapable of understanding the downstream consequences of his actions.
that's for sure. Well, I appreciate so much that you keep, the families at the heart of the book. You start off the book with the description. I mean, it is incredibly hard to read. You describe, that day in December of 2012, the emotional impacts. You describe, what public record, maybe some that hasn't been necessarily. And you described that the Heslins and the Parkers, and Emily Parker and Jesse Heslin and Noah Posner. Is it Posner or Posner?
Posner, yeah.
Posner, you said right, Phony. And just, I mean, it's absolutely impossible not to be drawn in, of course, even for those of us who remember it at the time. And then it's very interesting. You described the, even like the post tragedy, the immediate post tragedy, and then I think rings true with a lot of people, even if we've experienced a loss, not just this horrific loss and tragedy of such epic proportions, but that's like kind of being made to be like charity cases, right? And
Yeah,
you write about all the people that donated things, and you couldn't even
yeah,
fit it in the town and all of that. And
yeah.
just, so I guess it just leads to the question about what you discovered about the parents, and wanting to be in the public spotlight but also not, and just finding that balance over the years.
Yeah, I mean, part of what happened to them, and Lenny Posner puts it best when he says, we felt like spectators to our own tragedy.
Mhm.
That, when you lose your children, your loved ones in such a high profile, visible, horrific, historically horrific way, you're you're sort of out there. It becomes this very personal tragedy to them becomes a kind of national holding for people.
Mhm.
And everyone feels sort of, that story is being retold in media. There was a deluge of media attention. They started to feel like everyone wanted a piece of them, and they were feeling exploited, and they felt like this charitable giving that was taking place, in particular, the United Way was raising money for the United Way and its programs, some of which would benefit the families, but not all.
Right.
They felt like they were using the names of the victims to raise this money and then designating it for their own uses rather than to benefit the families themselves. And that is what was happening. And, so I was documenting how that made them feel. And so the reason I did all that, rehash that history, was that when this came along, this conspiracy theorizing and these falsehoods started entering their radar screen, this was yet another example of them, being kind of feeling preyed upon
Mhm.
by, other forces that were determined to use what they had suffered for their own ends. And in Alex Jones's case, it was to make money.
Right. You document very well about, obviously social media was really coming into its own in positive ways, negative and positive, just strictly numbers wise, which obviously a proliferation of these false stories that maybe that did exist before, but before it was Alex Jones on a public access channel in Austin, Texas. Right
Right.
now it's proliferating. But
Yeah.
like with like Robbie Parker, right? His daughter's Emily, who was a victim. And you just broke it down so journalistically about there's this press conference, right, where he has this piece of paper, and he gives a speech of sorts, and just about how that became so dissected by these conspiracy theorists. But you're right. Well, here's why he had this what looked like a grimace or a smile. Here's why. Right.
Yeah.
And as we all know, and as you describe so well in this book, the facts don't matter, right? The
Exactly.
facts just
Yeah.
absolutely do not matter. And you talk about like echo chambers and all of that. I remember someone on CNN, I think it's kind of like a quote unquote conservative, or like conservative. He was not a Trump fan, right? Like a
Yeah.
Republican. And he said something
Mhm.
to the effect of like, talking about those people who know that Trump's lies are wrong, but repeat them,
Yeah.
because they don't want to get voted out. And he said something to the effect of like, there are worse things than a former politician, which is
Yes.
my long way of getting to the question. Like, there are worse things than not engaging. Like, what do you see in the psychology of like this Kelly Watt and these
Yeah.
figures who just, why do they feel they need to weigh in on the situation? This was a tragedy. These were people killed. This is horrific. Why can't they just not weigh in? What is it that makes them so obsessive?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer to that was a kind of revelation to me too, as I looked at, and talked with these conspiracy theorists. What they're getting from this, as Lenny says, Noah's dad, is a whole new identity in a lot of cases. So you mentioned Kelly Watts. So she is a woman who has a house cleaning business in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That was, what she did for a living. And she always had a kind of sideline conspiratorial interest. Back in the 90s, while her own sort of home life was falling apart, she was convinced that the Tulsa public school system was being infiltrated through the curriculum by liberals, and that liberal values were distorting, the minds of Tulsa school kids. And she pursued this, showing up at school board members' houses, disrupting meetings, parent-teacher conferences, confronting principals over textbooks, really vociferously pursued this conspiracy theory while her kind of personal life was falling apart around her. So she had a lot of disappointments in her life. She never really achieved the things she wanted to achieve in terms of a career and all of this, she told me. But what happened with Sandy Hook was it sort of transformed her from, as she described herself, a janitor in Tulsa, to someone who contributed to James Fetzer's book. So she became an author, and she was a researcher, and she was a citizen journalist. And so she really, in her mind, elevated herself. She gained a whole new circle of friends. They listened to her, they paid attention to her, they repeated her theories about the shooting, which circulated around the idea that no one can tell her who cleaned up the school after the shooting, which is an absolute falsehood. Those records exist. She, even when told that they exist and that it was easy to find out who cleaned up the school, the company is a reputable company. They actually cleaned up after 9/11. That she just dismissed that out of hand. And the reason isn't that she doesn't believe it. The reason is that threatens this whole world that she's built around herself, around the Sandy Hook falsehoods. It's given her a completely new social group and social status. And that's true of all of these people. And they are not ready to give these up. So it's not about truth and falsehood to them. It really is about identity and tribe and membership in a group.
Right. Very well said. Thank you. I mean, sad and pathetic in all senses of the word.
A lot of these things really speak to how lonely we are as individuals in
that
this
came through so
nation.
strongly. Just people mired in in depression and sadness and what's the word that's always used now, like I can't remember the word, but just
despair.
grievance and despair, but just making up
yeah.
grievances, right, because of the despair.
Yeah.
So I guess that's another pivot into Alex Jones. One of the lines that you quote in the book is him saying, no, I'm not a businessman. Basically, I'm in a total war. And you do a great job too. You mentioned so many times, he goes off and he's red-faced and he's going crazy, and then let me just give you this advertisement for a nutritional supplement. How much of a huckster is, how much of it is just bottom line dollars? How much does he believe what he's spewing? I guess only
Sandy
he can
Hook,
answer that, but
he knows it happened. And if you go back and you look at the record, he pretty much knew it happened as it was happening. But what happened was, even in his initial broadcast, hours after the shooting occurred, you could see him start to embrace this conspiracy theory, partly at the behest of his audience, people who were calling in and saying, Alex, tell us how to think about this. Wasn't this the government? Do you think this was staged, et cetera, et cetera? These shootings seem to be happening every week. And what does this have to do with Obama? And is Obama behind this? And gun control? And he grasped in his mind the idea that a shooting, as the death toll became known, something this horrific needed to be, if you were against new gun legislation, which he, vehemently is, you needed to fight back with something more than just I oppose. And so this became, the chief tool in his arsenal. Let's
Right.
just say the government planned it in service of gun control. It makes it an unfair fight. If the fight is over gun policy and legislation, and I don't take a stand on that in the book because I don't want to muddy the message of the book, which is about disinformation.
Sure.
But if that is the debate, then fight that debate with facts. But what these theories tend to be is a way of fighting unfairly. If you don't like the results of an election, you just say that the election was rigged and that you actually won. If you don't like, that this in fact, Sandy Hook did not turn out to be a catalyst for meaningful gun legislation, at least at the national level. But the idea here was you turn it into an unfair fight by saying, no, the government plotted it, so then you're not having a meaningful debate over whether this particular incident warrants new gun laws and reform.
Right. Along with, of course, some of the lasting traumas, and so sad to read about the death by suicide of one of the Jeremy Richmond.
Yeah.
Pardon
Yeah.
me, Jeremy, who done such great work and such a legacy. In the prologue settles in, and it is beautiful as much as it's sad, describing some of the families who've been highlighted and their relationship with their kids, and cleaning out the rooms and the tears and all the beauty. And towards the end, before the prologue, is about a lot of the social media litigation, if you will, right? So there are some rays of hope there. The Alex Jones has been shut down in many ways on social media, on YouTube. He's been deplatformed in many ways. So I love for you to maybe end by talking about any remedies you might see. People, some of the experts mentioned things like, let's wait for comments to sink in. Like, let's give them 2 minutes or whatever, 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a day. Maybe some remedies you see for really combating all of these conspiracy theories, as well as Alex Jones, and now what, with the recent good news for those who are against him.
Verdicts against him. I think, on the out, just starting it with Alex Jones, I think that these judgments against him, first of all, the families, if this experience has taught them anything, it's patience. And, they've been involved in litigation with him for 4 years.
Right.
They're not going to stop now that they've received these verdicts. So there will be an appeal process. And then, they'll actually go about the business, provided all of this survives appeal, which the lawyers for the families expect it will. Then comes the hunt for assets and the effort to actually get paid.
Right.
This for the families has never been about the money, of course. It's always been about, showing the dangers of this kind of misinformation, the impact it has, as I said, not only on vulnerable people like the Sandy Hook families, but when you follow that through line and you get to the attack on the Capitol, which happened as I was finishing the book, it is eroding our democracy. If we cannot rely on a bedrock of truth and fact and established research and science, then we really have nothing to base our government on. Right. So that was their chief message. And, their triumph is that they have been able to drive that message by using their power as survivors of this horrific tragedy to speak out and stand up for that message and to warn the rest of us. So that's huge. And I think the fact that we are all talking about this right now speaks not only to current events and everything that's happened in the decades since Sandy Hook, but it also speaks to the fact that we are now as a nation beginning to recognize how destructive this kind of discourse is. So I think that's a triumph. Like in the gun debate, it's hard to point at this moment to substantive legislation or policy changes, but there certainly is plenty of research being done, not only into potential solutions, either on, the policy front governing social media and how this stuff spreads online, but there's also a lot of research being done into individual psychology and sociology, why people grasp onto these theories and are so reluctant to let them go.
Right.
And more importantly, to try and dissuade people from embracing these theories before they actually latch onto them, when it's much easier. And so there's some really important research being done, to try and inoculate people against these theories before they join these sorts of conspiracy circles.
Right. Do you get the impression in your reporting that the government is keeping a close eye, as far as like the government as an entity, like that there will be more government interference is not the word, but involvement?
There's certainly a lot of debate around it. There is a bipartisan effort to address the spread of this material, particularly online, and particularly the kind of falsehoods that lead to violence, like the 2020 election conspiracy theories that led to the attack on the Capitol, and on voting processes and polls and poll workers around the country. There is a recognition. I mean, if anything's going to draw Congress's attention, it's the fact that something might affect their ability to be reelected. So this has trained their minds. So whatever it takes. And I think that that's a positive development. I do think they will arrive at some solutions, but it will take time.
Well, I mean, it's impossible, it's stated explicitly sometimes and implicitly at others, but it's impossible to read this book and not see the through lines between, or connections, with Trump and Alex Jones, with from
they legitimized each other,
right?
Yeah,
I mean, from Aurora, or starting with Sandy Hook to Douglas in Florida, to Pizzagate, to QAnon, and the connections are clearly there. So I appreciate you, bringing the reader as close to empathy as possible for such a horrific situation that, if it would have ended in December 2012, would have been horrible enough. But just the years of abuse that they've gone through, and we're able to, as much as we can, like I said, get some empathy for those people, though we have not gone through what they have. Thank you so much for this important book, and thanks for talking to me today.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure.
What a pleasure.